dig into a 40-year study of semiconductor ecosystems and ask what it means when the companies that are supposed to help you actually slow you down. Plus, a small Spanish town of 10,000 people is now Europe's largest manufacturer of military ground robots, and rural food security in Ghana and Kenya is getting a serious rethink. Stay with us. I'm Art.
I'm Yan.
And this is The Rural Innovator, a weekly look at the research, news, and projects shaping rural innovation, drawn from the library at ruralinnovations.org.
All right, 3 articles this week, and they actually fit together quite well, almost like someone curated them on purpose. We've got a deep empirical piece on innovation ecosystems, the classic Chesbrough paper on open innovation, and a framework piece on what the authors call the Quadruple Helix. Let's start with the empirical one, because it sets the stage for the other 2.
Walk me through it.
So the paper is from the Strategic Management Journal. The title is a mouthful, but the core question is actually quite elegant. How does the structure of technological interdependence in an innovation ecosystem affect firm performance? And they're not theorizing in the abstract. They went and studied semiconductor lithography equipment from 1962 to 2005. 43 years, 9 full technology generations.
That's a serious longitudinal data set. Not many strategy papers work at that scale.
Right, and that's actually one of the paper's strengths. Lithography equipment is a good choice for this kind of study because every technology generation is relatively discrete. You can observe clear transitions, who survived them, and who didn't. So the researchers could track the same firms across multiple generational shifts and ask, what predicted survival and performance?
And what did they find?
The central finding is this. It matters enormously whether the challenges in your ecosystem are upstream or downstream. If the external innovators you depend on are struggling, meaning the component suppliers, the input providers, that actually benefits the technology leaders. But when the challenges are downstream, when it's the complementers, the application developers, the end-use integrators who are struggling, that hurts the leaders.
Can you unpack that a little? Because I think that's counterintuitive. If your suppliers are struggling, how does that benefit you?
It's counterintuitive, but here's the logic. When upstream components are the bottleneck, the technology leader, the firm at the center of the ecosystem, has more leverage. They can absorb that challenge, invest around it, or shape the component roadmap. It's actually a moment where their position as the hub of the ecosystem gives them a real advantage over rivals who might not have those relationships.
Whereas, if the downstream side is struggling, the leader loses because the value they're trying to deliver can't actually reach the market. The whole chain stalls at the application layer.
Exactly, and I think that's the part practitioners most often miss. There's a tendency to think about innovation strategy as managing your suppliers, but this paper is saying, watch your complementers just as carefully, maybe more carefully.
I want to push on the rural angle here for a second. Because when I think about, say, a rural tech startup or an agri-tech firm in a smaller market, they almost always have a downstream problem. The complements aren't there. The distribution infrastructure isn't there. The market intermediaries aren't there.
That's a really fair read, and I think the paper actually supports that anxiety. In thin ecosystems, which is essentially what rural innovation contexts are, you're far more exposed to downstream bottlenecks because the complementary layer is just underdeveloped. There aren't as many firms you can rely on to complete the value chain.
Which might explain why so many rural innovations that are technically brilliant just don't scale. The technology works, the ecosystem around it doesn't.
I'd add one caveat, though, and this is where I'd be careful about overextending the paper's findings. Semiconductor lithography is about as complex and capital-intensive as ecosystems get. The firms involved are large, global, and deeply embedded in each other. The dynamics might look quite different in a small market agricultural technology context. The paper doesn't claim universality.
Fair enough. But the framework, upstream versus downstream challenges and how they affect the core player differently, that framework feels portable even if the numbers aren't.
I think that's right. It's a lens more than a formula. Now, the second article pairs with this one almost perfectly. This is Chesbrough's The Era of Open Innovation, one of those pieces that's become so foundational that a lot of practitioners have absorbed its ideas without ever reading the original.
Chesbrough's the one who coined open innovation, right? Or at least popularized it.
He's largely credited with that, yes. The core argument is that the old model, where you built big internal R&D labs, kept everything proprietary, and controlled the full innovation pipeline, is no longer viable. Knowledge is too widely distributed. Markets move too fast. The most useful ideas for your company are often sitting outside your walls.
And the flip side, if you have knowledge inside that you're not using, you should let it out. License it, spin it off, let someone else commercialize it.
Right. It's bi-directional. Ideas flow in, ideas flow out. And Chesbrough argues that this isn't just a nice to have. It's becoming the dominant model because the alternative is just too expensive and too slow.
Here's where I'd push back a little on the Chesbrough framing, though. Open innovation, as he describes it, kind of assumes you have a large enough internal base to manage these flows. You need people who can evaluate inbound ideas. You need IP infrastructure to license outbound knowledge. A rural startup or a small regional development organization, they might not have any of that apparatus.
That's a real critique, and it's one the literature has wrestled with. The Open Innovation Framework was developed mostly through studying large, established corporations. Applying it to smaller or resource-constrained actors requires some translation.
And yet, the spirit of it, look outside your walls, don't try to own everything, that's actually very consistent with how the most successful rural innovation efforts I've seen tend to operate. The ones that work are the ones that plug into networks, not the ones that try to build everything locally.
I think that's where Chesbrough's ideas are genuinely useful at the rural scale, not the formal mechanisms, the IP offices, and the university spin-out programs, but the underlying philosophy, permeable boundaries, external knowledge as a resource, not a threat.
All right, let's get into the third paper, the Quadruple Helix. I'll be honest, I always found the triple helix a little abstract. What does adding a fourth helix actually get you?
So let's back up for a second. The triple helix model, developed by Etzkowitz and Leidesdorf, argues that innovation emerges from the interactions between three spheres: university, industry, and government. Each plays a distinct role, they overlap and co-evolve. And that interaction is where innovation actually happens.
Which is a useful model, but you can see what's missing.
Civil society, the public, the community. This paper, and it's from 2009 by Karayanis and Campbell, argues that you need a fourth helix, the media-based and culture-based public. They call the overall system Mode 3, building on earlier work about Mode 1 and Mode 2 knowledge production. And they argue that successful 21st century innovation ecosystems have to engage all four simultaneously.
And their concept of fractal innovation ecosystem. What does that mean in practice?
It's a bit of a metaphor, but the idea is that innovation systems are self-similar at multiple scales. The same basic dynamics, knowledge flows, actor interactions, co-evolution, play out at the local, regional, national, and international levels. So you don't build one top-down system. You build nested, interacting systems that reinforce each other.
That actually resonates with me. Some of the most durable rural innovation efforts I've seen aren't anchored to a single institution. They're kind of distributed across local champions, regional organizations, and connections to the national level. None of it is hierarchical.
And that's exactly the pattern the Quadruple Helix is trying to describe. The fourth helix, civil society, culture, community, is often the piece that's either ignored in the design of innovation programs or treated as an afterthought. We'll do community engagement at the end. But this framework says no, that helix has to be co-evolutionary from the start.
I'd actually push back slightly on the framing, though. I think calling civil society a helix, putting it at the same level as university, industry, and government, might overstate how much institutional power communities actually have in most innovation systems. In practice, the fourth helix often gets consulted, not co-designed with.
That's a fair tension. The paper is aspirational in that sense. It's describing what the model should look like rather than necessarily what it does look like. But I'd say that's a feature, not a bug. It gives practitioners and policymakers something to aim for.
Fair. And for rural innovation specifically, I think the quadruple helix has more urgency than in urban contexts. Because in cities, civil society has more resources, more voice, more density. In rural contexts, if the community isn't actively shaping the innovation agenda, it's very easy for the other three helices to design something that works in theory and gets rejected on the ground.
That's a strong framing, and it links back to both of the previous papers, Chesbrough's open boundaries and the ecosystem paper's attention to the full chain of actors. These three pieces are actually telling a coherent story. Innovation doesn't happen inside firms or institutions alone. It happens in networks, and the health of the full network matters.
Good place to transition. Let's talk about what's happening in the world this week.
We've got 5 media items this week. Let me start with Vietnam because it touches directly on something the Quadruple Helix paper is getting at: the role of the state in driving digital transformation in hard-to-reach communities.
What's the story?
Vietnam's Ministry of Ethnic and Religious Affairs is pushing hard on digital transformation in 2026, and they've made a specific point of saying they're shifting from planning to measurable results. The ministry is building integrated databases for ethnic and religious communities, streamlining 25 public services, and, this is the piece I found most interesting, developing AI tools for minority language translation.
That last piece is significant. Minority language access is one of those barriers that gets described as a cultural problem, but is really a governance problem. If your government services are only accessible in the dominant language, you've already excluded a big chunk of rural and indigenous populations from the start.
And AI tools, machine translation especially, have matured enough that this is now tractable in a way it wasn't 5 years ago. The question is always whether the translation quality is good enough for complex administrative interactions, not just tourist phrases.
Right. There's a real risk of deploying a tool that technically works but produces translations that miss nuance. In a legal or health context, that's not a minor inconvenience.
The story doesn't go into that level of detail, so I'd watch for the implementation reporting. But the ambition is real, Vietnam's moving fast here, and the framing of measurable results by end of 2026 suggests they're at least trying to hold themselves accountable.
Next story, Ghana and Kenya. This one's about food security, and it's actually quite concrete.
Yes, UNDP's Climate Promise program has a piece on rural communities in both countries adopting climate-resilient innovations. In Ghana, an organization called Open Ghana set up dry season gardens using solar water pumps and village savings schemes. The combination, irrigation plus community finance, allowed vulnerable farmers to grow vegetables year-round, not just during the rainy season.
The savings scheme piece is important. Technology without the financing mechanism doesn't reach the most vulnerable farmers. You need both.
The Kenya side of the story is about additional innovations. The article mentions climate-resilient crops and practices. Though the detail is lighter on the Kenyan examples, what both cases share is the bundling of technology, community organization, and financial access. None of those elements alone gets you there.
Which is actually the Quadruple Helix in action, even if nobody called it that. You've got technology providers, local government, community savings groups, and, presumably, some NGO or donor structure in the background. Multiple helices, all engaged.
It's a nice illustration. The third news item brings us to Mexico, and this is a connectivity story.
Rural connectivity in Mexico. What are the numbers looking like?
Stark. Only 66% of rural residents in Mexico have regular internet access, compared to 85.5% in urban areas. That's nearly a 20-point gap. And given how much of modern economic participation, financial services, government programs, market access is moving online, that gap is compounding.
And the proposed solution?
Low Earth Orbit Satellites, LEO, and specifically Starlink. The story reports an $89.8 million contract to provide free internet through the end of 2026, aimed at reaching remote southern communities where fiber and cell infrastructure simply don't reach.
I've got mixed feelings about the Starlink as rural solution story. On one hand, it works. The technology delivers real broadband to places that have never had it. On the other hand, you're creating a dependency on a single private provider for critical public infrastructure. That's a governance problem waiting to happen.
And a contract that runs through 2026 doesn't tell you what happens in 2027. Continuity of access is the thing to watch. The initial deployment is actually the easy part.
It also doesn't address the device side. Getting a satellite signal to a community is step one. Getting affordable devices, local technical support, and digital literacy into the hands of the people who need to use it. That's a whole separate infrastructure challenge.
Right. Connectivity isn't just the pipe, it's the full stack. The Mexico story is about the pipe, which is necessary, but not sufficient.
France next. Smart villages? What's the French angle?
France is implementing its Smart Village program through two main mechanisms, the Common Agricultural Policy Strategic Plan and the LEADER program. So they're channeling EU funding toward digital capacity building, co-working spaces, and rural innovation platforms. The French Rural Network is also doing active research on what's working and publishing practical guides for municipalities.
The co-working space piece is interesting. That's not a technology story. It's an infrastructure of place story. You're creating conditions for knowledge workers to be able to live in rural areas rather than having to move to cities.
And there's a post-pandemic argument here that's gotten stronger. Remote work normalized the idea that location and productivity can be decoupled, at least for knowledge work. Co-working spaces in rural communities are trying to capture that shift before the pendulum swings back.
The LEADER program is a long-running EU instrument. It's been going since the early 90s. The fact that France is still deploying it and pairing it with KAP strategic planning suggests a level of institutional continuity that rural innovation programs in other parts of the world would envy.
Agreed. The EU's funding architecture for rural development is far from perfect, but it does provide a stable, multi-year platform. That stability matters for the kinds of long-horizon projects that rural innovation actually requires.
And the last news item, Binéfar. This one stopped me when I read it.
Yes, Binéfar. That's spelled Binefar, a small town in the Aragon region of Spain, population somewhere around 10,000, has become home to Europe's largest manufacturer of ground robots for military applications. The plant currently employs 150 workers, with plans to expand to 300.
300 jobs in a town of 10,000 is not a small thing. That's genuinely transformative at that scale.
The story frames it explicitly as a reversal of rural depopulation, which is a chronic problem across rural Spain, particularly in interior regions like Aragon. The facility exports to over 20 countries, so this isn't a locally oriented business. It's a globally competitive manufacturer that happens to be located in a small town.
Which flips the usual narrative about rural economic development. We often talk about fitting the enterprise to the place: farming, tourism, local services. Binéfar is doing something completely different. They've planted a globally oriented, highly technical manufacturing operation in a rural location.
The question I'd want answered is, how did it get there? Was there a pre-existing industrial base, a specific policy incentive, a founder with roots in the town? The Euronews story doesn't go deep on the origin, but that origin story matters a lot for whether anyone can replicate it.
And the military robotics angle raises a separate question that's worth naming. There are communities that would welcome this kind of investment and communities that would push back on it hard. That's not a disqualifying observation. It's just a real part of the social license conversation.
Fair. The Quadruple Helix would say the civil society dimension of that decision has to be part of the process, not just an announcement after the deal is done. Whether that happened in Binéfar, we don't know.
Good. Let's move to organizations and events.
We didn't add new organizations to the directory this week, but I want to use this segment to highlight two of the actors that appear across our news stories, because they deserve a closer look. Open Ghana and the Smart Rural 21 Network, which is the source of the France story.
Tell me about Open Ghana.
Open Ghana is the organization behind the dry season garden initiative we discussed. They're operating at the intersection of agricultural technology, community finance, and climate adaptation. The solar pump and savings scheme combination they've deployed is notable because it's not trying to import a single technological solution. It's bundling technology with community institution building.
That bundled approach is actually harder to fund than a pure tech project. Donors like clean, discrete interventions. Solar pumps for farmers is an easy pitch. Solar pumps plus savings groups plus farmer training plus market linkages is a much harder budget conversation.
Which may be why so many rural technology deployments underperform. They get funded for the technology piece, and the surrounding ecosystem never gets resourced. Open Ghana seems to have figured out how to keep the bundle intact, which is worth studying.
And Smart Rural 21?
Smart Rural 21 is an EU-supported network that documents and shares smart village experiences across member states. Their France country page is essentially a structured overview of what France is doing in the smart villages space, what programs are active, what's being funded, what the French rural network is publishing. It's a useful comparative resource if you're trying to understand how different EU countries are approaching the same challenge.
The comparative dimension is something we don't always pay enough attention to. France and Spain are both EU members, both dealing with rural depopulation, both deploying leader funding, but the approaches look quite different. France is investing in digital and co-working infrastructure. Spain, or at least Binéfar, seems to have gone the route of attracting a specific high-value employer.
Both can work. The question is what the community has to start with, and what kind of innovation ecosystem can realistically be built from that base. There's no universal playbook, which, incidentally, is exactly what the Quadruple Helix paper is arguing.
No events added to the calendar this week, so let's move into closing thoughts. We've actually got a rich week to work with.
We do? And I want to name the thread I keep seeing across all of it, because I think there's something genuinely important here. Whether we're talking about semiconductor ecosystems in the academic literature, or dry season gardens in Ghana, or military robotics in rural Spain, the same basic question keeps surfacing. Who is the ecosystem really serving, and who's actually shaping it?
Say more about that.
The lithography paper tells us that ecosystem structure determines who benefits from innovation transitions, and the structure isn't neutral. It reflects past investments, past relationships, past power dynamics. The Chesbrough paper says open up the boundaries, but open to whom and on whose terms? The Quadruple Helix tries to answer that by insisting that civil society has to be in the room, but in the room is doing a lot of work in that sentence.
I think about this a lot in the rural context. Rural communities are almost always downstream in the ecosystems that affect them. Policy gets designed in capitals. Technology gets built in cities. Investment decisions get made by institutions that aren't based there. The community is at the end of the value chain, in the language of that first paper.
And the first paper told us that's exactly where you're most vulnerable. Downstream challenges are the ones that hurt the most.
So the question isn't just how do we bring innovation to rural communities? It's how do we restructure the ecosystem so that rural communities are not perpetually downstream?
which is a much harder problem. And I think Binéfar is interesting precisely because it represents an unusual case where a rural community somehow ended up as a core player, not a peripheral one, in a global value chain. How that happened, and whether it can be deliberately engineered rather than happening by accident or historical quirk, is a question I'd really like to see more research on.
I'd push back very slightly on characterizing Binéfar as a model, though. A single military robotics manufacturer in a specific Spanish town, that's not obviously transferable. The conditions that made that possible are probably quite particular. Whereas the Ghana model, solar pumps plus community savings plus market access, that combination feels more portable, at least across comparable agricultural contexts.
That's fair. And it gets at a deeper tension in rural innovation policy, which is the tension between place-based specificity and scalable replication. The things that work in rural innovation tend to be deeply embedded in local conditions, which is exactly why they work and exactly why they're hard to copy.
The connectivity story from Mexico touches this too. Starlink solves a real problem, the pipe problem. But the pipe problem is actually the easiest part of the rural digital divide to solve with money. The harder parts are the skills, the devices, the local support infrastructure, the digital trust. Those are embedded in community, and they don't scale the same way a satellite constellation does.
And Vietnam's language translation initiative is an interesting counterexample. If you can build AI tools that work in minority languages, that's a technology that does scale, potentially across many different language contexts. It's not plug and play, but the underlying investment is more transferable than a satellite contract tied to one country.
So maybe the lesson, and this is me trying to find the thread across the week, is that the interventions that travel best are the ones that lower the cost of the human and institutional infrastructure, not just the technology infrastructure.
I like that framing. Technology infrastructure, pipes, pumps, satellites, is necessary, but it's the human and institutional layer that actually determines whether an innovation ecosystem generates lasting value for a rural community or just passes through it.
That's actually where all three academic papers land when you read them together. The ecosystem paper says, structure matters, and who controls the structure matters. Chesbro says, knowledge flows don't stop at your walls, so build institutions that can manage the flow. The Quadruple Helix says, make sure the community is one of the architects, not just one of the beneficiaries.
And if the rural innovation field has a persistent failure mode, and I think it does, it's that we build the technology layer first and then discover the institutional layer was never there. We've seen that with broadband, we've seen it with precision agriculture, we've seen it with rural fintech. The pattern repeats.
Which is not an argument against the technology. It's an argument for doing the institutional work simultaneously, not sequentially. That's actually the harder discipline. It requires more patience, more local knowledge, and often less credit for the people doing it.
Well said. And on that note, this week gave us a lot to sit with. 3 decades of semiconductor data, open innovation theory, helix models, solar pumps in Ghana, robots in rural Spain, and satellites over Mexico. There's a coherent conversation somewhere in all of that, and I think we found at least the beginning of it.
A good week for the library.
That's the week. The full library, every article, every news item, every organization we discussed is at ruralinnovations.org. The newsletter that started this whole conversation is there too, and you can subscribe if you want this in your inbox every Friday.
See you next Friday.